Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland is out today. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program Sam Bagenstos, law professor at the University of Michigan, author of the Inside Outside newsletter. Sam, welcome back to the program. I don't know if you remember. I remember our interview very, very honestly. It is one that I've thought about many, many times over the years. It was about 8 years ago in December when we were anticipating the first Trump administration. And I wanted to talk to you because you had served in both, if I remember correctly, the Clinton DOJ, I think it was, and then in the Obama DOJ. And so you knew the implications of 8 years of Bush and what it did to these agencies. And here we are in maybe a similar type of situation, or a little bit, but different in some very, very radical ways. And so let's just, broadly speaking, and then obviously want to get to all of these different court cases and where we're going to from there, because you wrote a really fascinating piece about the value of calling out when people are breaking the law, even if there's no army to enforce it. Broadly speaking, like remind people what happens to agencies when there is an administration that is fundamentally at its core against the functioning of a lot of these agencies.
Yeah. And I think what we're seeing now is that, but accelerated to a tremendous degree, right? So the kind of destruction that we saw in 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, they're working on doing in the first couple of weeks of the second Trump administration, for example. So what happens? So we have these agencies that do the people's work. We have agencies that are protecting consumers against predatory banks. We have agencies that are paying for really important medical research, which, by the way, also helps to ensure that the hospitals that you go to all around the country are able to make their budgets work and keep the lights on and the doors open. And what happens when you attack these agencies is you make it impossible for them to do that important work. You have great people leave these agencies. And, it's a truism, but it's true. It can take 100 years to build something and a matter of weeks to tear it down. And then we're back to another 100 years to build it. And that's what I really fear we're in the middle of now. When I look at all of the really important programs that people rely on getting destroyed, when I look at the incredibly experienced and dedicated public servants who are saying, I don't need this, I'm leaving, we're going to be in a hole for years and years and years after this administration because of the destruction that they're wreaking right now.
And we should add, it's not just the destruction of like the sort of institutional knowledge within these agencies. I literally today at the place I get my coffee, they know I do this show. The guy said, I was looking into NIH grants and, because I'm a historian, and I realized I got to maybe look for a different career. Like, there's people in the pipeline. We just had someone who got their master's degree in labor relations. She's a field examiner and wants to spend her career at the NLRB. And that person 5 years earlier is going like, I'm not going to study this stuff because who knows if there's going to be anything there.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly right. And, so the result of it is really generational, that it's going to be that much harder to get back to where we are. And, these people, like if what you want to do is biomedical research, right, that's important for your career. But it's also important for the world at large. I mean, the amount of knowledge that we're going to be losing because of this, the breakthroughs, the benefits to people's lives, it's just stunning to contemplate.
Okay, so that's sort of like almost the baseline for a Republican administration that we've been talking about. This is something times 10, or 100, or maybe it's based upon who's like sort of doing this. We should say 10x or
Right.
100x. But give us a sense. I mean, there's so many different court cases that are out there, and we have like multiple jurisdictions who have ruled on sort of almost the same questions. And they all basically, across the board, seem to have all basically issued like temporary injunctions for the most part. We haven't had any sort of final adjudication on this stuff. But it's also unclear that any of these agencies or that DOJ or the Trump administration's listening to any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those points are really important. Number one, the courts have stepped in pretty immediately on a lot of these issues. We're seeing a pattern across the government of, basically Trump and Musk saying that they're not going to be bound by any laws that Congress passed. Doesn't matter that Congress created the U.S. Agency for International Development. They don't like it. They're going to destroy it. It doesn't matter that Congress created, the Department of Education, and there's no power to get rid of it. They don't like it. They're going to try to destroy it. Congress said you can't cut the money that NIH provides to hospitals and research institutions. They don't care. They're going to cap it anyway. And yet the courts are stepping in pretty aggressively to say, hold on a second. This really looks like a violation of the law. Stop. And, I think what we're hearing from Trump and Musk is sort of them speaking out of two sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they're making noises like they're not going to comply with the law. They certainly want you to think they're not going to comply with the law. They would like everybody to, be cowed and thinking there's no way of stopping these folks. On the other hand, they haven't asserted any authority or power to defy a court order. When they've gone into court, they've said, we're trying our best to comply with the orders. They've appealed the orders they disagree with. So right now, although they're trying to send the message that they won't be constrained, I think they also recognize that if they really want to pick a historic fight like that, I mean, I think a lot of people would say we're already in a constitutional crisis. Once they say we're not going to comply with the court order, no question we're in a constitutional crisis. And it's not clear they actually have the guts to do that because, the courts will have a say, Congress will have a say at that point. And I know all these institutions look kind of supine right now, but the more they very explicitly and brazenly defy the rule of law, the more folks are going to push back. We've already seen that among some of the Democrats. We've already seen with the NIH actions, even some of the Republicans, including some quite conservative Republicans like Katie Britt, pushing back. So
just
I
about
think
Alabama. Let's be clear. I mean,
yeah.
She's like, she wants a carve out. I mean, to be fair.
I mean, but the thing is, all of the, yes, so of course that's right. But all of these actions that they're taking, they're attacking this sort of abstract idea of the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is not abstract. It provides important things that people rely on all across the country, in some ways in red states more than blue states. And so I think that's, at the end of the day, going to be what creates a political constraint as well as the legal constraints coming to bear.
Okay. So as a political matter, I want to just sort of sort this out a little bit, because I've seen their propaganda machine is out there basically for the most part. You do have like Vance and a couple other people saying like the courts have no business doing this. And then they also say almost in the same breath, because all we're doing is auditing, right, which is, of course, not what they're doing. So they're sort of like, that's showing some weakness. And I wonder, like, what is it that, do you think, is it just the fact that, like, at one point, the rubber actually meets the road and this impacts people's lives? Katie Britt may not care what's happening in, some other state, but the largest employer in her state is about to lose a huge amount of its ability to employ people. And so she's sort of saying, oh, but Alabama doesn't count. But is it, do you think, I mean, I'm surprised that they don't have a legal strategy that they haven't deployed already, because this is a plan. Trump was out there talking about that the Impoundment Control Act, 1974, and then I guess there were also like Train v. New York. There were Supreme Court cases that sort of reinforced the Impoundment Control Act, which basically says, like, when Congress says you need to, we appropriate money, we're not saying you can't appropriate more than this. We're saying we want you to appropriate this amount of money, period. That's it. You don't get to choose. Maybe how you execute that appropriation is there's some leeway, but you need to appropriate that money. He was making videos about this in 2023. And so that Trump was putting out. So they clearly have been ready for this. Do they basically know they have no legal argument? So what they're trying to do is just create chaos and let the chaos do the work rather than them actually being able to execute a plan? Or what do you think their strategy is as both a legal and political matter?
Yeah, and I will say I think there is a division within the administration, and one of the things we're seeing is that playing out. So on the one hand, you have like the Russ Votes, the new head of the Office of Management and Budget, his general counsel at OMB, Mark Paoletta, who you may know from that painting with Justice Thomas, where they're all sitting around smoking cigars with Harlan Crow. And yeah, so he's sitting there right next to Justice Thomas in that famous painting. And they're the legalists. You know, they're the people, they want to tee up a case to go to the Supreme Court to challenge the Impoundment Control Act. I was Mark Paoletta's successor as general counsel at the Office of Management and Budget at the beginning of the Biden administration. I can tell you all about that. They really want to push that.
Did it smell like sulfur in the office?
Well, I will tell you, he left me in the office a big portrait of Calvin Coolidge, which I on my first day replaced with the portrait of Franklin Roosevelt. But you know, I will say they want a court fight over this. But then there's Elon Musk. And Elon Musk, who now seems to be very much in the driver's seat, you know, has Trump's ear, has the favor of the new emperor, essentially. Elon Musk, you know, he has this Silicon Valley play of move fast, break things. You know, it doesn't matter if we violate the law, we'll clean that up later. You know, just like Uber going into all these towns, you know, and breaking all the laws and then saying, well, what are you going to do about it? Right. And that's the Musk play, which is what they're running now. Which means, I mean, you know, the legalists, the people who really want to tee up court fights, are finding that the court fights that are getting teed up are not putting them in the best light. You know, if you wanted to be strategic about this, you would, you know, pick particularly wasteful, particularly bad uses of money, you know, not spending money to help protect people against HIV or stop infectious diseases that could come to the United States and hurt Americans, not spending money that is, you know, on the biggest employer in the state of Alabama. And by the way, some of the biggest employers in every state, red states and blue states, right? You wouldn't be doing that. And so I think there's this tug of war going on within the administration, and that's what we're seeing.
That's fascinating. What if you were, I mean, and maybe this is hard for you to assess, but from a legalistic standpoint, I mean, so these guys think they have the votes to chip away, if not completely, overturn Train v. New York, or to say the Impoundment Control Act is, I guess, unconstitutional on some level. I don't know what the grounds would be for that. It's pretty explicit, but maybe it's the word appropriate, and maybe they would start to say, like, well, you know, I can't force you to spend every dollar I give you. I can give it to you, but I can't force you to spend it. Maybe that's the argument that they would have. What agency would you have picked if you were in that painting with the Harlan Crow? What agency would you have picked? Like, what would have been the case that you wanted to bring, rather than the sort of like almost chaotic array of cases that are there?
Yeah, I think if putting my sort of evil, bizarro Sam hat on, I think what I would do is try to find, some particular program that, some kind of corporate welfare that everybody left and right would agree is wasteful, that Congress appropriated money for, that clearly seems to be a bad use of money, and say, we're not going to do this. I mean, you might remember when the line
Medicare
item,
Advantage.
yeah, right. Well, of course, we have a new head of CMS, Dr. Oz, who loves Medicare Advantage. But yeah, I mean, you might remember when the line item veto act was adopted in the Clinton administration, Clinton used that for the first time and teed up the court test with a very specific tax break that was just a giveaway to sugar beet farmers in Louisiana. And that's the sort of thing you would do if you were really, and he lost that case anyway, because the court said, no, look, Congress passes a law, Congress has to change the law, the president can't change the law unilaterally, even if Congress tells him he can. I don't think that Trump is going to prevail in challenging the Impoundment Control Act. Obviously, people like Russ Vought and Mark Paoletta disagree with that. And, I get it, because it's an extremely conservative court. It's a court that loves executive power when Republicans are in office. And it's a court that's delivered Trump some really huge signature wins. So I get why they're confident. I think they may be a bit overconfident, but they're certainly setting this up in the worst possible light for themselves.
And it's also sort of tough for them based upon the recent, essentially reversal of the Chevron deference doctrine too, right? I mean, because the heart of that is that the agencies don't really know best. And so they don't really, Congress would need to tell them not to cut as well. I mean, or to cut rather. I mean, that seems to cut against them too, right? Just is it like a general, or does the Supreme Court not really care about that level of consistency?
Well, I mean, it is a very conservative Supreme Court, and they've found, the ability to be, I'll just say, very supple in their reasoning and distinguishing various cases. But you're absolutely right that there would be a tremendous tension, if not outright inconsistency, between the way they've been talking about, we have to assert the primacy of Congress here. Presidents aren't kings. Presidents don't get to act on their own inconsistent with Congress. And then they would say, oh, but by the way, the power of the purse, which is the very first congressional power listed in the Constitution, which comes from the practice in Great Britain, something that the founders of the Constitution really cared about, giving Congress the power of the purse. Yeah, that doesn't matter so much. The president can just override it. I think that will be hard for them to do. I'm not saying you won't find conservative justices who will do that, but I have a hard time counting 5 votes for them on this, but we'll see. I mean, it's a court that certainly delivered Donald Trump some big wins before.
So if their legal if they're not pursuing the legal strategy, what is your assessment? And maybe, who knows, because maybe you need to take a certain amount of ketamine to fully understand the strategy that Musk has. But what is your sense of like what his strategy is? I get the Uber analogy. That's the first thing that came to mind as you were saying that. Like, we're just going to go in and break, but they had a very specific narrow agenda, right? In terms of which law they wanted to break and where, they knew. Like, why USAID first? I mean, or is that just something that he assumed, like, nobody cares about foreign aid, and people always think it's bigger than it is? And is that your sense?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, yes, if you were attributing a strategic goal there, I think that might be it. The idea that it's foreign aid, nobody cares. Now, in fact, it's of great benefit to people in the United States as well, in various ways. And I think they might have miscalculated there, but maybe that's what they were thinking of. I think it's also clear there's just this animus that Musk personally has toward USAID, and that has kind of grown up on the right. The language about post-apartheid South Africa oppressing white Afrikaners that we've seen from the White House, including this sort of bizarre thing, we're against all refugees except we want to take in all white Afrikaners from South Africa. I think that is a part of why they targeted USAID. The idea was, well, USAID was supporting, people who weren't, supporting sort of anti-colonial movements in the past, but who knows? I mean, I think there is a degree to which Musk is a chaos agent, and trying to attribute too much of a strategy to him is probably a fool's errand.
Okay, and let's talk about this. You wrote a piece on February 2nd. Why write about the illegality of what Trump and Musk are doing? Because even if these courts rule as they have, and I think subsequent to you writing this piece, the courts have ruled largely, almost exclusively, I think, in against the Trump administration, what they're doing. And like I say, we have different areas where it's unclear whether the Trump administration is listening to these courts, even though they're not necessarily, at least within the courts, challenging the court's jurisdiction here, I guess. But as a political question, you're writing about the value of branding what they're doing as illegal. Talk more about this, and whether, since you wrote this piece, it was only 10 days ago, but then again, he's only been president for 3 weeks. So this is like, talking about the life of a child at 2 months. 3 weeks is 50% of their life almost.
Yeah.
So what is your sense? Explain that notion to us about the political value of writing about something that's illegal, even if the court doesn't have their own army to go out there. And then let's take an assessment as to the political actors and the way they're using these court cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, what I want to say is the value here is not that courts are going to save us from Trump. I mean, ultimately, the solution to Trump is a political solution. The question is, how does talking about this in the language of the law matter? And I think it matters for this reason. When we talk about the law, it's not an abstract thing. What the laws are that Trump is defying is acts of democracy. It's our democratic constitutional system acting in the best way it can, coming together and saying, we want to fund these particular kinds of projects. We want to have a Department of Education because education really matters. We want to have foreign aid because that matters. We want to pay for and promote basic research through NIH because that really matters. And, we come together as a community, as a democratic polity. Congress passes a law, the president signs it. Another president comes along and says, I don't like that. That is not just something that is, technically a problem. That is something that flies in the face of basic democratic premises and also subverts the decisions that we, the people, have made. There was an election. Trump got more votes than the other candidates. He won the election. That doesn't mean he gets to undo the democratic decisions that have been made over time any more than any other president gets to. And I think that's important. I think it's also, and I think it's important to make that point. These are not just sort of ordinary politics, kind of grubby back and forth kind of arguments. I think it's also important that when you have these violations of law, that can be a rallying point around which people can organize. That can be something that people can point to. That can be something that can be used to hold to the fire, the feet of people in Congress who might be able to do something about it. We have a government funding deadline that we're about to hit in just under a month. And at that point, the Republican Party is probably going to need the votes of some Democrats to keep the government open, and the Democrats have some leverage in Congress, even though they're a minority party. Understanding that what Trump is doing is violating the law on a massive scale, hopefully can give them some fortitude to demand that if we're going to help you keep the government running, you're going to do these things to stop violating the law. And of course, there are times when courts are going to step in and stop particular discrete violations, but all of it is part of making the case that this is an administration that is subverting democratic decisions in ways that cause real harm to people all over the country.
We just spoke to a field examiner at the National Labor Relations Board. She was on not representing the agency about the organizing that federal workers are doing. And they've set up a site where people can go and provide both testimony as to like how these agencies help them and whatnot. You mentioned that the Democrats have leverage here, which is literally the opposite of what the minority leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, said the other day. He literally said at a press conference, "We have no leverage." And now Axios is reporting that folks like Richie Torres are literally resent how much they're hearing from their constituents about you need to be doing more. Give me your sense of because like you say, the odds are stacked here, but these court cases are not just court cases and not just legal proceedings. They are political bludgeons if somebody picks them up and starts to use them. And, this person we had on from the National Labor Relations Board said our commissioner was fired illegally. Never happened before. 90 years, fired without cause, can't do that. She had 3 years left in her term. And I'm seeing some members of Congress get out in front of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, some, getting out in front of the USAID. But overall, as a cohesive political party, are you seeing stuff from the Democrats that suggest, Chuck Schumer's out there saying, we just got to wait. He's going to make a mistake. It seems like the mistakes have been made.
Yeah, so yes, you're seeing more and more stirrings from Democrats, but it's still, I would say, very depressing. I think there's nothing more demobilizing for the Democratic base than a leadership that is saying, well, let's just wait and he'll trip over his own feet. And then at that point, we'll be there to point at him and say, well, look, you can't trust him. That's not what Republicans do when Democrats are in office. I was a political appointee in the Obama administration. I remember it very well. Obama was an extremely popular president when he was elected. Had Congress, had both houses of Congress, and it wasn't like Mitch McConnell said, okay, well, I guess we just better wait till he messes up. Instead, they very aggressively acted, the Republicans did, in a relatively unified way to create and impose on the world a narrative about overreach by Barack Obama from the very beginning, not just to wait until he stumbled, but to construct everything he was doing as a stumble. And yet what we're seeing now is again, increasing stirrings, and that's great. But I
think Chuck Schumer called it people were getting aroused. I think it was.
I mean, I read that article in Axios yesterday. Look, I've been a political appointee in Democratic administrations. I totally get it. Democratic elected officials, high Democratic appointees are frustrated by quote unquote the groups. That's what that was what the Axios, that is a dog bites man story. But the fact is, these are folks who are the Democratic Party base, and they are crying out for the Democrats to do something, leaders in Congress to do something to help shape the narrative about what's going on, because that's what's going to pay dividends. It's not like waiting back and saying, hoping the price of eggs goes up and then pointing to Trump and saying you're responsible for the price of eggs. I mean, the price of eggs is going up. He's not doing anything about inflation. It's great to talk about that. Probably what he's doing is going to make inflation work. It's great to talk about it worse. It's great to talk about that. But, right now what we have is an assault on all of the institutions of governance that people rely on in their lives, to protect them against predation in the economy, to provide them essential services. And we need people out there for the Democratic Party from the leadership making that case in a dramatic way, not sending letters, not press releases, standing behind a podium with, well-crafted sentences, but doing something that actually attracts attention about that.
20 years ago, I feel like we were still sort of like crazily living in the specter of George McGovern's run in 1972. There was still this and it was why I think Democrats were so weak in responding to what happened in 9/11, this sense of being, afraid of being considered a hippie. Now, 20 years later, nobody in this office except for me knows what the word hippie means, and we're in a different era. But this reluctance, this is like the proverbial. This is the opportunity to espouse the benefits that government does, and the failure of the Democrats to sort of embrace that feels like now we're living in the specter of the Clinton administration, which entered in saying the era of big government is over, essentially, echoing what Reagan had said. It's almost as like we're, we are trapped in 1993 still. And despite the fact that there's this like golden opportunity to show in real terms, not hypothetical, but like literally like, hey, the reason why 1% of our population in this country right now is walking around afraid about what's happening next because they're federal workers. They actually do things. Remember all that thing where government can't create jobs? Well, why is Katie Britt, begging Donald Trump to stop? Those must be creating jobs. What is it? How do we get past this specter?
Yeah, we need to be out there making that case, and it's very frustrating because there was this moment in the Biden administration, where I was very proud to serve on the domestic side of the Biden administration. We cut child poverty in half at the beginning of the Biden administration. We increased health insurance to the highest levels. We had the lowest uninsured percentage in history. We cut the price of prescription drugs for people. We showed how government can work and make people's lives better. And then, we lose an election and all of a sudden everybody's back to this, Clinton era defensive crouch. And
it felt like actually like even a year before the election, nobody was talking about any of that stuff, frankly. Well, Sam, hopefully we will talk with less than an 8-year interval, but it will be under better circumstances. Sam Bagenstos, we will put a link to the Inside Outside newsletter. Really appreciate your coming on and your perspective on this.
Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.